This show is brought to you by SalCal Real Estate Connections. Welcome to the Telescope View, and we're here tonight with the author of The Final Revelation, The Sun Project, co-host Rick Teles, and of course yours truly, Larry Mangello. And tonight's show, believe me, is a good one. We're going to talk about Colonel Philip Corso and his past participation in the programs when it came to ETs and UFOs, and boy, let me tell you, his history, Rick, is beyond belief, and I'm sure you got a few things you want to talk about that.
Well, Philip Corso is an interesting story. We've been hearing a lot in the UFO world on TV. You hear a lot about reverse engineering technology. Colonel Philip J. Corso was on, he was a career military officer in the Army. He worked in Italy. He was part of our intelligence corps, or head of our intelligence corps for the United States Army for a number of years. In the end, he was on the staff of President Eisenhower's National Security Council for 4 years. So he was a very well-placed individual. He had a tremendous service record. We were talking a few minutes ago. I have his service record right here, and all the assignments that he had and the different things that he did, intelligence, all different things. So he was a very credible person. In 1997, he wrote a book and published a book called The Day After Roswell. And this is what got everybody stirred up. In this book, Colonel Corso talked about the fact that he was responsible for helping to reverse engineer alien technology found at Roswell in 1947.
And believe me, that technology is used today and is very special.
The interesting thing is, I remember I got the book right when it came out. I wanted to read that. And it was very interesting in 1997. Now, again, I worked in the computer field, so some of the stuff he was talking about I was familiar with. But the interesting thing was some of the things that he was talking about had been mentioned by Jesse Marcel in 1977 and 78 when he talked about the Roswell crash. Now, in 1977 and 78, there are certain things that weren't known, like fiber optics. But yet, Marcel described something he called fishing line. That looked like fishing filament, okay, which we now know to be fiber optics. But this is the type of thing that Corso claims that he was involved with. That under General Trudeau, he was part of what they call the Foreign Technology Desk at the Pentagon. And he said he was chief of the Foreign Technology Desk for a number of years. And some people have criticized him, saying that, oh, there is no such thing as chief of the Foreign Technology Desk. It was head of the Foreign Technology Desk, or this was written in the report. And in the beginning, his record, his service record, didn't say chief or head. It just said Foreign Technology Desk. Well, to me, that's not a big deal. If you know anything about the military and the way they keep records, first of all, that's not a big deal. Secondly, when it started, there was only one person on the Foreign Technology Desk, which was Corso. So it wouldn't have been noted that he was head or chief or whatever. And then later on, it did say chief of foreign technology. None of those things mean anything because in the end, it was probably a title he was given so that he could get a better pension when he retired. But he was the only one working with these technology, and he mentioned a number of technologies that we are pretty familiar with today. And again, we have a photo of Colonel Corso. Looks like he's upset about something here, or he's listening. He's not believing somebody in this photo. But he worked with a number of different technologies. He talked about fiber optics, talked about lasers, particle beams, processor chips, computing processor chips. He talked about all these, and he claimed that he worked with different groups, including private organizations like General Electric and Motorola. And he would seed some of this material to them and let them work with it. They never knew where it came from. So and that's what we want to talk a little bit about tonight.
The printed circuits, the wafers, the silicon wafers. Let me tell you, we didn't get that technology just by someone waving a magic wand.
Well, some people would argue that when he said he got some of this, which was the early 60s, that people like Motorola and General Electric were already working on integrated processors and processing chips. And it's true they were, but they had reached a stumbling block. They weren't moving. What I have here is an old processing card This is actually a communications card, but it has a number of processors. These are actual processors up here on the top. Those are processing chips,
Yep.
All right, information processing chips. And then down here we have a lot of storage chips. And what would happen here is, because it's a communication card, the processing of the communications would happen here, but these processors here, and you can take this off, I can take this off, and actually the processor, if we were to peel off this little gold piece here, you're going to see the circuits, would actually use all these storage chips to do its calculations, and because it has a process in a storage area. And it would use those. And this is circa 1980s. This is
that was like state of the art back then.
In 1980s it was. But the problem was that back in the 60s, when he said he was doing this, we were reaching stumbling blocks. All right, we didn't know how to do this. We were still working with transistors at that point. In the 60s, remember, we were creating a lot of transistors. Even the radios that we used, military radios, were tube based until 66, 67. They started using more transistors because we really couldn't figure out how to make all this work.
Yeah. Now, in the book, it really is interesting, Rick, how he got this done. A lot of people think that, he could not tell them where he got his information.
Right. He would end up having meetings with people and saying, well, we have ideas like this. Why don't you take a look at this? And they would say, well, where'd you get that? Oh, it's just something, we came up with. So it was kind of hard to get it out there. And that was the rules that he had to live by. And again, Trudeau said, here's what you're going to do, General Trudeau, and here's how you're going to do it. And he said he was in this one little room with an office, and he had some, you can picture the gray metal government filing cabinets that he had. And he would pull stuff out of there every now and then, and he would seed it out. Things like chips. And like he said, the circuits, they didn't understand how the circuits and how to create gates and turn gates on and off electrically and that type of thing. And that's what he seeded out there. And it's interesting that some processing, as far as integrated processing chip technology, some major developments actually came from the Air Force at one point. So there was a lot of different groups involved in this.
But there was a lot of commercial companies too.
Yeah,
private companies.
General Electric,
involved
IBM.
Involved in doing things, and really they didn't know where it came from.
IBM. I remember working, it's funny how that works, because I remember working on a project one time, and the company I was working for was a company called United Nuclear, which used to be here in Connecticut.
Yes.
And they built nuclear reactors for naval vessels. And my job was to program tests, they were called criticality tests, to see how radiation could be contained within certain types of vessels. And we even did a test using paraffin. I mean, wax is not going to hold radiation, but we did it. So anyway, but one day I needed a file, and I said, I need a file to do this certain test, so you need to, can I get it? So you fill out this form, and then somebody brings the file and they put it on your desk. Well, they came and they put this file on my desk. And I opened it up, and I'm looking at this, and I'm saying, first of all, this isn't the file I was supposed to get. When you do get that, you're supposed to close it and put it away.
Yeah.
And I did. And I'm reading this thing, and I'm not a metallurgist, but I was looking at it, and I'm saying, I've programmed different types of metals in to be tested. This looks like nothing I've ever seen. I thought there was something wrong. So I took it over down the hall to a guy who was a metallurgist, and he looks at it and he goes, where did you get this? I said, oh, they dropped it on my desk. Why did they drop it on your desk? I said, well, I requested. He goes, well, it shouldn't have gone to you. Well, the long story short on that one was there was a guy there, his name was Bruce, and they kept confusing Bruce and myself. So I think this was supposed to go to Bruce, and it came to me. He looked at it and he goes, I've never seen anything like that. He goes, I don't know where that came from. I don't know what that's about. He goes, just give it back and don't say anything. Don't say you even looked at it. Just give it back. And that's, I don't know what it was, and maybe it was some really new alloy that somebody was creating. But it's that I can see where it would be that same type of thing where a scientist or a researcher got a piece of something and they said, try doing this, and you plug it in, and you know how researchers are. They'd say, oh, wow, look at that. That's pretty cool. That worked, and then they work backwards.
Now, one of the things that came out of his realm there was night vision, which is very interesting in itself. How did they come to find this?
Night vision was one of them. How they could filter out certain certain types of light. They'd be able to filter it out. Light has a frequency, just like radio. We think of radio, but when you go on in radio, you get into the light frequency, and that's where lasers start to come in. Now, we knew lasers could exist because Einstein talked about lasers. But with the night vision, they were able to now filter out certain frequencies of light, which would allow them to see in the dark. Now, that came into Vietnam late in Vietnam, but that was akin to radar in World War II. All of a sudden, I own the night, and we heard that for many years. We own the night, and even today we see that. I know that you see a lot of police cars. Remember the old light on the side of the police car, and they shine that beam?
Yeah, spotlight.
Well, if any of you don't know, that's not a light anymore. That is both infrared and night vision. So there's nowhere you're going to hide, and you won't even see the beam. So if a police officer is looking for somebody in the dark, they turn that on, they shine it, they look at their computer, and it's like day.
There it is.
And they can see heat signatures. So yeah, we learned that from supposedly technology that was taken from the Roswell crash. Another one was fiber optics, which was the filaments that Marcel talked about.
Marcel said they looked like fishing line.
It looked like fishing line because that's all he knew at the time. And that's a perfect example of how in history we tend to describe things with something we can relate to. So in the 70s, all Marcel could relate it to was a fishing line. This is how we can see back in the 1800s or whatever, somebody sees something scratched on a wall in Egypt and says, well, it must be a chariot because you didn't know anything about airplanes. But yeah, they came up with fiber optics. We've all seen fiber optics at this point. We tend to see the little ones that are like toys that you play with and the lights come out. The real fiber optic cables are pretty thick and there's a lot of fiber in them. But now we can push information through these fiber optic cables using a laser, which means the bandwidth can get much larger. I mean, we can stuff a lot more information into those fiber optic cables, and we use them now for just about everything. I remember back in the 80s using twisted pair, copper twisted pair, and that was a big deal, and we used coax. When we started putting in fiber, that was a big deal. Of course, the problem with fiber is you couldn't pull it because at that time you'd break it. But he came up with fiber optics was another one that he was talking about. And of course, fiber optics require lasers to work. So that was another one that he said came from Roswell.
Yeah, well, it came from that, the alien craft in reality.
Yeah, anybody who's not familiar with Roswell, 1947, something crashed in the desert at Roswell. And the story was that a rancher found some material that he didn't know what it was. He brought it to the local Air Force base. Air Corps base at the time, long story short. They took a look at it. The base intelligence officer, who had to be a pretty smart man. This base was the base in Roswell for the 509th bombardment group.
I mean, you're talking about very smart people.
This was the only nuclear bombing group in the world at the time. They're the ones who dropped the bombs in Japan. They looked at this, and his commanding officer looked at it, Blanchard, Colonel Butch Blanchard, and they said, this is nothing of this earth. So that's what we're talking about. And then the story of course, the Army then came back and said, oh, no, that was a mistake. It was a weather balloon. Well, I'll tell you, these two men are not going to mistake a weather balloon for any other type of technology. But, you roll forward a number of years to 1997, and Corso said, no, that was all true. I got some of this. He even said he got it in boxes. They brought it in cardboard boxes and said, here, do something with this.
Do something with it.
The fiber optics were all rolled up and put into a box. So, yeah, he said, this is where we got this information. The book is called The Day After Roswell. It was published in 1997. If you want to read something interesting, pick it up. You can get it, actually you can get it online in PDF if you type in The Day After Roswell.
Well,
You've been looking at it.
I'm going to tell you, Rick, between reading your book, The Final Revelation, The Sun Project, and reading The Day After Roswell, all my suspicions about UFOs and do they exist or not are put to bed. Trust me.
I think we give some good reasons for why this is real. And we also talk about both sides. We talk about the pros and the cons. We talk about, some of this stuff is very real and some of it isn't. But, getting back to Corso, the other thing, when you talk about fiber optics, you talk about lasers.
Lasers,
But then he moved into talking about lasers as weapons and lasers, different types of lasers and particle beam weapons. And at the time, people were saying, this is just not possible. You can't do it. We know it is today. We know very much that this is all possible today. In 1997, that sounded strange. In 1978, it sounded even stranger. And in 1947, I'm sure it sounded strange. But I have a photograph here of some very real laser weapons. It's called LAWS, LAWS for Laser Weapon System. They were real creative on that one. But what you're looking at on the lower, let's say the lower thirds, 2/3 of the photo, are ship-based laser weapons. And these things can shoot down just about anything because they move, the pulses move at the speed of light. The interesting thing about laser weapons today is, yes, they're real. We can mount them in ships. We can mount them on tanks. We are using them. They have been used in the Middle East. And again, don't take my word for this. Just go and look it up. But the thing is, there was a show on a while back about the new aircraft carrier we have, the Gerald R. Ford. And in the Gerald R. Ford, it's brand new technology that nobody can match. And there's a couple things they have on the Ford. One is an electromagnetic. Instead of using a steam catapult system, it's electromagnetic. We're using electromagnetics everywhere, launching. We're even using for weapons. We'll get into that with the particle beam. But the Gerald R. Ford also now carries a laser weapon. So it can protect itself. It sends laser bolts. It also has an electromagnetic rail gun. But this is all technology we're now putting into play. And in 1997, not possible. 1978, oh, that's Star Wars. That's not real. Star Wars is more real. You know that. It was more real than anybody think.
Talk about SDI, right?
Well, and that's what we have in the upper corner, upper right-hand corner there. That is an image, because nobody's ever seen them, except the people who build them, of a space-based laser weapon.
Yeah.
For some people who don't know, if you look back in the news a few months back, a couple of Chinese satellites disappeared. And they don't know what happened to them. And we don't either. Nobody seems to know what happened to these satellites. Some people suspect it was a little object lesson.
Yep.
The interesting thing about space-based laser weapons is they're not an explosive weapon, so they probably aren't controlled by the treaty that we had to limit weapons in space. But what you're seeing there is an image of, I think, was this General Electric or Martin Marietta? I'm not sure who built this one or who, this is a drawing from which one. But that's a space-based laser weapon. And what those type of things can do,
it's beyond belief.
It's almost limitless. But he wasn't done with that. Then he talked about particle beam weapons.
Yeah.
And this is an example of General Electric and Lockheed of a particle beam weapon that they had, a rough drawing that they had, because this stuff is so secret now you can hardly get any information about it. There was if I remember right, United Technologies in East Hartford had a particle beam laboratory for a number of years. That's gone now, where they did testing with lasers and particle beams. So a lot of people were involved or are involved in this. And if you talk to people publicly, they'll say, this stuff doesn't exist. It's still on the drawing boards. But then you get them alone and they'll say, we can hit the head of a pin with one of these things. Yeah, I bet you can. And there was and I'm pretty sure, I'm not sure if it was a particle beam or a laser weapon. A couple years back in the Middle East, when on the Gaza Strip, they were launching these missiles. They weren't the Scuds. They were another type of missile. I can't remember the name of it. But it was a missile that was basically a big pipe, and it would fly through the sky. And I remember watching one news program where they were actually tracking this missile, and all of a sudden it just broke apart in midair. And the news commentator said, then we could see how poorly constructed these missiles were. Because
little did he know.
There's one, here's another. Look, they're all breaking apart. And I thought that was interesting, because I'm saying to myself, that is exactly what a beam weapon does, a laser beam weapon, a particle beam weapon, or even an ultrasound weapon. It breaks things like that. And you could go online and you could actually find YouTube videos of those tests. Well, I decided I'm going to ask somebody who would know this. And I checked with him. I said, are we using that stuff? Have we been using it? He goes, well, I'm not going to say we're using it, but if you were to ask me, are we testing it in the Middle East? Oh, yes, definitely. It happens. And that's what we were watching. When these things broke apart in the air, they were being hit by either a particle beam or a laser.
Oh, sure.
Laser weapon.
In the Gulf War, when they talked about laser-controlled bombs.
Yep. Those are intelligent bombs.
You're not kidding. Wow.
They follow it down. They follow the laser point down, which now all it takes is, if you illuminate a target with a laser point, the bomb's going to find it, and that's pretty precise. So, Corso claims, and in the book, that he did a lot of this reverse engineering. I have to say, in the book that I did, the men that I spoke to, they said to me, and we have a section on this. They said Corso was telling the absolute truth. He was absolutely right, and they talked about a number of weapons that we did develop, that including a couple that they mentioned by code name, but wouldn't tell me exactly, what the weapon did and how it worked.
And what's interesting, Rick, is they really don't tell you. You don't hear who was the real enemy we were worried about.
Well, and Corso mentioned that because he mentioned in some of his papers that not only could we use this against enemy aircraft, but we could use it against non-terrestrial threats as well. Why are you going to take a lot of time to protect yourself from non-terrestrial threats if they don't? You know how our government is. We're not going to do anything until after it happens.
That's
usually.
right. That's right.
Didn't Will Rogers say that? We're the only ones who get ready for a war after we're in a war, or something like that. And most people aren't going to know who Will Rogers is, but yeah, I mean, he said some things that I know people said this has got to be crazy, and yet I'm talking to men who, when you talk to these people behind the scenes and they tell you that it's like, what do you want us to tell us? We can't go out there and say we're doing this.
You have to remember, too, that to fund all these things, you could not just say, give me any money for no reason.
Yep.
You had to say, well, we think this domestic enemy we need to protect ourselves.
Well, yeah. I mean, again, and I wrote about this a bit. I don't want to push the envelope. We pushed the envelope, but we didn't want to push it too far. But there are companies out there, and I wrote about them, called carve-out projects. And to do a carve-out project, the government goes out, and it might be the Defense Advanced Project Research Agency, DARPA. They go out and they create a company. And for all intents and purposes, it looks like a private corporation.
Yep.
It even does real private consulting work. I worked for such a company. I did consulting, systems development, computer consulting stuff. I did a lot of security consulting, cybersecurity consulting. And I did some very real stuff. I worked on HIPAA, believe it or not, which drove me absolutely insane, and I don't blame me for it. But at the same time, we were working on other stuff as well that we couldn't talk about. But the interesting thing that I did not know at the time that I learned years later is, people like in the private sector, they paid us for our consulting. I worked for 3M. I did work for 3M.
Yeah.
I did work for some municipalities, and they paid the company for the work I did, and it was pretty expensive. Any revenues, any profits they made went to the black budget.
Yeah. I mean,
and this is a private company.
When you think about, what was developed, stealth, good example. How do you develop a plane that cannot be detected by radar?
Yeah,
I mean, think about that one.
They always had the ideas, but they didn't know how to do it. And the interesting thing for some people to know is that, where is this being done? Well, it's not being done at that base where everybody expects it to be done. When I worked, we had 2 offices. We had one in Stamford, Connecticut, and we had one in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Oh, right next to MIT.
MIT.
That's where we did work. That's where it was happening. You had Griffiths Air Force Base in upstate New York that got some stuff from Roswell. People never knew that. Griffiths is gone now, or most of it is. People never knew what we were doing in that building in Stanford or in Cambridge.
Well, the good thing is private companies do not have to tell you what you're doing.
That's one of the reasons why it was done. Private companies are not subject to the Freedom of Information request. So if I was working on something secret, even for DARPA, and somebody came to me and said, "What are you doing?" I'll say, "Well, I can't tell you." And they're going to say, "You have to tell us." No, you don't. We're a private company.
That's it.
I mean, we wouldn't say we're working on it for DARPA, but we're a private company. We're working on this and can't do anything.
Well, Rick, I'll tell you, as usual, the subject is getting better and better. And time is flying, and we're going to have to be leaving tonight. And I want to remind everybody to please go to The View Show at AOL.com. And Rick, also, there is a place where they could go to find out a little bit more about what you do.
All the stuff that we talk about, if somebody wants to see some more articles on all these topics, you can go to facebook.com/ET Intelligence Report. Facebook.com/ET Intelligence Report, and just read all the posts and articles there. You'll see a lot of stuff.
Believe me, it's good reading. Well, we want to thank you, and good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.